The medieval tactic that wiped out thousands in minutes was not born from superior numbers or the most advanced weapons of its age, but from a calculated understanding of how men and armies behaved under pressure. It was a blend of deception, terrain manipulation, and precise timing, designed to lure an opponent into a space where their advantages vanished and their vulnerabilities multiplied. Once sprung, the trap could break a force's cohesion in moments, turning a seemingly balanced fight into a rapid, one-sided collapse. Number 1. Setting the stage for medieval warfare. In the Middle Ages, war was rarely about simply swinging heavy swords. It was shaped by careful strategy, control of terrain, and reading the enemy's intentions. Armies were mixed forces that brought together heavily armored knights on horseback, infantry in chainmail or padded protection, and skilled archers capable of killing from a distance before melee combat even began. The outcome of a battle often depended on how well these groups were coordinated. Knights dedicated their lives to training in mounted combat, mastering lances, swords, and shields. Foot soldiers drilled with spears, axes, and pikes, while archers trained to release precise volleys with longbows or crossbows that could decide the fight before the sides even clashed. This structure existed within the rigid social system of feudalism, where discipline in the ranks could vary, but loyalty to one's lord remained absolute. Commanders understood that one decisive action could change the tide of a war, and so they sought tactics that not only inflicted physical damage, but also broke the enemy's will to fight. One such approach, a meticulously timed ambush, was capable of crippling entire armies in under half an hour, not through sheer numbers, but by exploiting anticipation, overconfidence, and poor communication. Throughout medieval Europe, deception was a recognized weapon of war. Among the most effective was the feigned retreat, in which troops pretended to be overwhelmed and fled, drawing the enemy into unfavorable ground. This required soldiers with strong discipline and coordination. If the fake withdrawal became disorganized, the maneuver could quickly turn into a real defeat. History offers concrete examples. In 716, Charles Martel used a false retreat at the Battle of Amblève to pull his opponents from a strong position, only to counterattack once they were committed, inflicting heavy losses. Similarly, at the Battle of Lechfeld in 910, Hungarian light cavalry experts in mounted archery used staged retreats to break apart German formations and lead them into traps where they could be destroyed. Other cultures refined the same principle. The Normans famously employed it at Hastings in 1066, tricking parts of the Anglo-Saxon line into abandoning their defensive position on a hill. The Seljuk Turks used it to great effect during the Crusades, including at the Battle of Harran in 1104. Farther east, the Mongols elevated battlefield deception into an art form. They used false retreats alongside psychological tactics, lighting extra campfires to exaggerate their numbers, dragging brush behind horses to create massive dust clouds, and employing flag signals for seamless battlefield coordination. What these examples share is a focus on control rather than brute force. By manipulating the enemy into a position where their strengths became weaknesses, such as trapping cavalry in tight terrain, or separating infantry from their main force commanders, could win with fewer men and fewer resources. This kind of tactic showed that the most decisive weapons in medieval warfare were not always swords or siege engines, but the ability to mislead, outmaneuver, and strike when the opponent's guard was down. Through a combination of foresight, preparation, and timing, entire armies could be destroyed in minutes without a single prolonged clash. Number 2. The lure into the killing zone. In practice, the trap opened with a controlled lie. A feigned retreat staged by light troops or mobile cavalry who looked convincingly shaken, gave ground in small bites, and never broke formation enough to lose control. They showed their backs just long enough to trigger the weakest part of many medieval armies, status-driven overconfidence, especially among mailed elites trained to finish fights with a decisive charge. Once that impulse took hold, pursuit felt irresistible. The pursuers accelerated, lines stretched, and tidy ranks unraveled as faster riders pulled ahead of slower men on foot. That loss of cohesion was the first victory for the defenders because the bait was leading them toward prepared ground, not an improvised scuffle. Commanders chose terrain that disguised engineering work. a gentle dip that hid ditches, a hedged lane that funneled movement, a tree line masking archers and crossbow crews. Shallow trenches were cut to catch hooves rather than halt men outright. Sharpened stakes or makeshift chevaux de frise angled to break a charge, and sometimes caltrops scattered where eyes would be fixed on fleeing backs instead of the soil underfoot. The goal wasn't a wall, but a filter narrow the front. Stack bodies into a cramped space and kill momentum. Timing held the plan together. Rearward trumpets and banners paced the sham retreat so it didn't collapse into panic, while observers on the flanks watched for the moment when the enemy vanguard outstripped its supports. When the leading pursuers crossed an invisible line, often where ground began to pinch, the signal rose. Archers started high, indirect volleys to disrupt, then flattened their arcs to aim at gaps when armor angles became visible, while crossbows worked more slowly, but punched clean lanes through shields at closer range. Because the kill zone was narrow by design, even modest rates of fire felt overwhelming. The same number of projectiles that a wide battlefield would absorb now saturated a corridor, and each fallen horse or man became an obstacle that multiplied the chaos. Shock cavalry, deadly in open space, lost their advantage here. Lances were harder to couch in tight ground, a spooked mount skirt stakes by instinct, and riders forced to slow lose the kinetic energy that makes a charge bite. Meanwhile, infantry on the defenders' flanks advanced behind pavises or interlocked shields, not to duel, but to seal exits and press bodies inward. Think of it as a closing valve. Fire fixed the enemy in place, obstacles held them there, and compacted mass made every new hit more damaging than the last. Command and control mattered just as much as carpentry. Feigned retreats demanded drilled units that could turn on a beat, with officers ready to pivot from running to fighting without a lag. Signal discipline horn patterns, banner shifts, even prearranged drum codes kept the choreography tight when dust, wind, and shouting blurred vision. Weather and sun angle were part of the plan. Having the light behind your archers helps. A crosswind can shove arrows offline, and a dry field throws up dust that hides flanking infantry until they're close. None of this worked if scouts did their job. Smart attackers sent out screens to probe hedges, tested soil with dismounted men, and advanced by bounds rather than a single glorious rush. The lure depended on pride-outrunning procedure, on the belief that the enemy was already beaten. When that belief snapped into focus, the rest followed. The vanguard became isolated, the supports compressed behind obstacles, and leaders struggled to pass fresh orders through a corridor filled with fallen mounts and jammed shields. Defenders held reserves back until they heard the note change. The moment pursuit turned into a pileup, then released a punch where the corridor widened just enough for their own push, not before. The tactic's power was that it converted the attacker's strengths into liabilities. Speed became separation. Armor became weight when men stumbled and gouged earth. Elite status became a trap because the troops most eager to prove themselves arrived first, bled first, and broke morale for everyone watching behind them. In medieval warfare, where news traveled by eyesight and rumor, those seconds mattered more than tons of steel. The killing zone was less a place than a sequence. Provoke, draw, narrow, fix, and crush. When commanders aligned terrain, engineering, psychology, and timing, the result was not a long melee, but a short catastrophe minutes of concentrated damage that decided a day before most weapons touched. Number 3. The storm breaks. The instant the vanguard crossed the invisible boundary, the defenders shifted from deception to orchestration. Arrows rose in sheets, bolts punched straight lanes, and the battlefield narrowed from open ground into a corridor of force. Longbow units worked on cadence. Most trained archers could loose roughly 6 to 10 shafts a minute, starting with high arcs to disrupt, then flattening their trajectories as targets slowed, and gaps in armor appeared at the visor slit, armpit, groin, and the joints where plates met mail. Crossbow crews, slower at 1 to 3 shots a minute depending on windlass type, made up for pace with penetration, waiting to fire at closer distances where a heavy quarrel could fracture a shield boss or wreck the leverage of a couched lance. Spacing mattered. Archers stood far enough apart to avoid fouling each other's draw, yet close enough for overlapping fields that created a beaten zone. a space where any forward step kept attackers inside a steady drizzle of steel. Horses turned from assets to liabilities the moment momentum failed. A single fallen mount became a barrier that forced riders to weave. A second and third created a chicane that killed speed. And speed was the only reason a charge worked. Stakes and shallow ditches didn't need to stop hooves outright. They only had to make an animal shy or sidestep at the wrong moment, which broke the lance line and exposed riders to low, deliberate shots. As the front compressed, defenders shifted ammunition, heavier bodkin heads to punch into thinner plates, broadheads to open faces and hands, and fire at saddle height to unseat without needing to crack the cuirass. Sound carried the change before sight did. Horns cut through shouting to signal flank infantry forward, while drums told bow captains when to pause, when to switch aim point, and when to step through to clear the next rank's line of fire.